How many times have you heard this chord progression? This is the most common chord progression in music. It's called a G major to a C major, and most pianists would play it like this. But there are way more interesting ways of playing these chords like this. Or this. Or this. So in today's quick tip, I'm going to teach you 10 different ways that you can play these chords so that your piano playing will sound even more interesting. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, we're going to start with the chord progression. It is such a simple chord progression. G major to C major. Okay, so quick review on the chords, and then we're going to dive into these 10 different ways of harmonizing this. The basic chords are G major. I've got, B, D, G. This is like a G major chord, but it's inverted down here on the piano, and then we go to a C major chord like this. Okay, so this is the basis of this lesson. So the first technique I love to use to make this progression sound more interesting is to play what I call barbershop chords. Okay, now if you listen to barbershop music, uses a bunch of dominant seventh chords. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to take this chord progression, instead of playing G like this to C, we're going to make it a G7 like this. We're going to put a little F down there on the bottom, and it makes it just sound a little bit more interesting. It feels like it leads a little bit more to the C major chord. And by the way, we're going to double the E on the bottom like that. Okay, so this is kind of the first step. If you're playing a G to a C, is just add the seventh of the G7 chord. A G7 has these 4 notes in it. Now, if you don't know your dominant seventh chords, it's okay. You can learn them in our dominant seventh chords course, along with exercises. But you really want to practice this basic chord progression. I'm also going to make this chord a more interesting chord. Instead of just playing a C major, I'm going to add this B there and turn it into a C major 7. Okay, so this is kind of step number 1, is make your chords seventh chords. The first chord is a G7, the second chord is a C major 7. We're also going to add a little melody in the middle to make this chord progression a little bit more interesting. Now here's the trick to finding this note. If you're not sure what the seventh is of the chord, if you're playing a G7, it's going to be a whole step down from the root. The root note is G, you go down a whole step to F, and there's our G7. Okay? For the C major 7, it's a half step down from the root, C down to your major 7th, that's just a half step down, okay? So that's kind of step number 1, make sure you can play your 7th chords. All right, before we move on to step number 2, if you're enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button for more videos just like this. Okay, step 2 is to play what I call Debussy chords, okay? And Debussy would take chords like the G7, and he would add a 9th to these chords in A. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to take that G7 chord and we're going to put the 9th in it, which we call the A, okay? And it sounds way cooler. It's starting to sound a little bit jazzier because we're getting this 9th in there, okay? Now, how do you find the 9th? Well, the 9th is simply a whole step above the root note. That's G, we go up a whole step to A, and there is what we call the 9th chord. So if 9th sounds confusing, don't worry, it's just a whole step above the root, and that's going to be the trick to finding this chord. We're also going to take that C major 7 that we played like that earlier, and we're going to add the 9th to this chord as well, which is the D. And once again, it's just a whole step above the root of the chord, C. Now, the 9th is called a chord extension, and if you don't know your chord extensions, you can learn all of them in our chord extensions course. I'll put a link to that below. Okay, so once you have the 9th in there, what's the next step? How do you make it sound even more jazzy? Well, the next step is to add the 13th, and the 13th sounds like this. I call them stock jazz chords because they work on almost any melody that you would play in a jazz fake book. Okay, so here's what we're going to do here. We're going to take this chord that we just had with the 9th in it. Okay, remember we're just playing a G7 like that. We're adding the 9th. We're going to add the E. Okay, we call this the 13, okay? Now don't let the word 13 scare you too much. The 13 is simply 3 half steps below the root. In fact, that's our little trick here to finding the 13. So we know the root is G. we go 1, 2, 3. That's our 13. And it will sound instantly more jazzy. Now, if you want to learn different ways to apply the 13 to your chords in different chord progressions, check out our Coloring Dominant 7th Chords course. I will put a link to that as well below. Okay, let's move on. So now we have a G13 chord. It's sounding pretty nice. But what if we want to take it to the next level? Well, the next level is what I call stride chords, and it has this sound. Okay, really, really colorful sound. This is actually used a lot in stride music. Okay, on that G7, we're going to add a really cool note. And if you recall earlier, we had this G13 chord. Now we're going to take that 13, that E, and we're going to make it flat, making it a flat 13 chord. Okay, so this is still a G7 chord. We have the 9 in there, so it's called the G9 with the flat 13, and we play it like this. Okay, now if you're not sure how to find your flat 13, really simple trick. It is 4 half steps below the root. So we start on the root, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we get that classic kind of stride jazz sound. Now the flat 13 is called a chord alteration. If you don't know your chord alterations, you can learn all of them in our Chord Alterations course, along with exercises. I'll put a link to that below as well. Okay, so we have a pretty cool sound here, but how do you make this chord sound even more interesting? Well, this is going to be step 5. This is what I call dark chords, and they sound like this. Oh, that sounds beautiful, okay? Check out this G7 chord. So now, I'm really adding some interesting notes here. Let's start off with what we already know. Let's actually start off with that G13 chord that I showed you earlier. It's a G7. We're adding the 13 and the 9. And I showed you some tricks to find these notes. What we're going to do now is we're going to lower that 9, that A, to an A flat. And this is now called a flat 9. And this chord has a really cool, kind of dark sound to it. Okay, John Williams uses chords like these a lot in his film scores, okay? So it's a very cool jazzy way of playing the chords, and then we resolve to our C major 9, just like this. Now the trick to finding your flat 9 is it's just a half step above the root, the G, so we go to an A flat, and then we play the rest of our chord above that. So we've got our G major, we have the A flat and the E on the top, okay? Really, really nice. Okay, so we've got our dark sounding chord. This is a very cool sound, but what next? How else could you harmonize this particular melody on a G7 chord in an interesting way? Well, the next chord I love, I call the Twilight chord. Okay, and the reason I call it the Twilight chord is because it reminds me of the Twilight Zone theme. Okay, that C sharp here, a D flat, is the note that we're adding to this G7 chord to make it what's called a G7 with a sharp 11, okay? And again, it's just a simple G7 that I taught you earlier. We're just adding this C sharp to the chord, and it makes it sound instantly more interesting and more jazzy. Now, how do you quickly find the sharp 11? Well, here's the trick. It's just 6 half steps above the root. So we start on the G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's there, and this is the note that we add, okay? And again, it just kind of has its own sound. Each one of these techniques have their own sound. I think of it as that kind of Twilight Zone type of sound. Now, if you want to take it to the next level, here's number 7. I call this the Bill Evans chord technique because Bill Evans, one of the most famous jazz pianists, loved to use this chord. Check out what this sounds like. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so basically Bill Evans, whenever he played chords like G7, he liked to use what are called flat 13 or sharp 9 chords. Okay, really crunchy, jazzy chords like this, okay? So here's what I'm doing on my G7. I've got my regular G7 like this, but I'm adding 2 really cool notes. We're going to add that E flat, which we called the flat 13, but now the really special note we're going to add here is the B flat, which we call the sharp 9, okay? And the flat 13 sharp 9 is a really cool combination that I recommend that you use if you want your chords to sound more jazzy. Now, how do you quickly find your sharp 9? Well, the trick is it's 3 half steps above the root. So we start on the G, we go 1, 2, 3, there's our flat 9. I mentioned you're going to use the normal chord tones for a G7, and then your E flat, your flat 13, is going to be 4 half steps below the root. So we start on the G, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's our flat 13. Okay, really nice way of playing chords. Now, if you want to learn more ways how to combine the chord extensions and alterations, you can learn this technique in our Coloring Dominant 7th Chords with Upper Structures course. I'll put a link to that below. All right, if you want to take it to an even higher level technique, this is technique number 8. I call these dream chords. Okay, doesn't that sound amazing? This technique comes from the whole tone scale. Okay, it sounds like you're dreaming a little bit, all right? So check out what we're doing. We're gonna take that G7 chord and we're gonna add a few notes to it. We're gonna add the 9, which we talked about, and then we're gonna add 2 more really cool notes. We're gonna add a D flat to this and an E flat to this for this very cool, dreamy kind of sound, okay? And this is called a sharp 11, a flat 13, and they're all whole steps away from each other. So starting from the G, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, they're all whole steps, okay? So this is gonna be that dreamy kind of sound. If you're starting a tune and you wanna harmonize that melody note, it sounds really nice. All right, technique number 9 is what I call the intro chord technique. This is a chord technique that I love to use on an intro to a tune. Let's say I was playing in the key of C, I might start with that beautiful chord here, and this is the one you're gonna learn. This is called a G13 sharp 11 flat 9 chord, and it has a very cool sound to it. Basically, I've got my basic G chord, and I'm gonna add my 13, which we talked about earlier, and then we're gonna add 2 more really cool sounding notes to this chord. A flat on the bottom, and C sharp on the top. Okay, it has a really beautiful sound to it. Okay, once again, it's called a G13 sharp 11 flat 9 chord, and it's got really rich color. It's again used a lot if you're doing a run up the piano like that, but I'm basically just playing that chord. Now, how do you quickly find these different chord tones? Well, if you want to find that flat 9, it's just a half step above the root. And if you want to find the sharp 11, it's 6 half steps above the root, okay? So you can easily count, depending on whatever dominant chord you happen to be playing, to find each of those chord tones. All right, before I show you the final technique, I want to mention that the lesson sheet music you're seeing up here in the top left of your screen is downloadable and printable, and this lesson comes with a backing track which you can download. I'll put a link to all of those below. All right, the final technique, if you want to get the coolest sound, this is your altered chord technique, and this is what this is going to sound like. Okay, really crunchy, jazzy chord here, okay? So here's what I'm doing. I'm playing my G7 like this, okay, all the same notes, but we're going to add some very cool notes, starting with the B flat. We're going to add a D flat and an E flat to this chord, okay? This is called the sharp 9. This is called the sharp 11, this is called the flat 13, okay? Now this has a very altered sound. If you want a very crunchy jazz sound when you're playing your chords like these, we call these altered chords. And the idea is we're gonna try to grab as many of our chord alterations as we can in this chord. So we've got the sharp 9, the sharp 11, the flat 13. Okay, that's about as many alterations as you can throw in the chord. The only additional one you could add is that flat 9 down there, okay? So here's a quick trick to finding each of these chord tones. You start with your basic G7 chord. We're gonna add the note 4 half steps below the root, so 1, 2, 3, 4. We're gonna add the note 6 half steps above the root, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? And then we're gonna add the note 3 half steps above the root. So 1, 2, 3, there's our B flat, and then we have the full chord. Hey, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this lesson, be sure to check out pianowithjonny.com. We have over 900 step-by-step lessons in jazz, blues, theory, technique, improvisation. It's the full learning platform for all playing levels. So go check out Piano with Jonny, and I'll see you in the next one.